Welcome to Back to the Texts Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video examines Chapter 5, Sections 31 and 32 of Heidegger's Being and Time. In the previous video, we examined attunement as an existential structure of the there. Understanding represents another existential structure and will be the topic of today's video. The two sections being covered here are some of the most important of all of being and time. Now, this claim may be surprising because Heidegger doesn't set it apart from the other existentials he examines. Nonetheless, unless we appreciate the function of understanding and its relationship to interpretation, we've missed out on perhaps the most critical and groundbreaking contribution of being and time. Let us recall Heidegger's purpose that he establishes for this work: to inquire into the meaning of being in general through a phenomenological and ontological analysis of particular beings, especially the being for whom being is of concern, Dasein, which requires then understanding how Dasein arrives at meaning. And so in this video, the following questions will be addressed. 1. What does it mean to understand in the mode of projection? 2. How does the fore-structure make meaning possible? And 3. Is Heidegger's conception of interpretation a form of circular reasoning? To make sense of what Heidegger is saying here, I will take a rather banal and perhaps, for some, odd illustration using my cat. Every evening around 6 p.m., my cat becomes uncharacteristically affectionate, meowing gently and seeking to press its head against my leg or arm. The meaning of this behavior is immediately apparent to me. My cat is hungry. This initially uninteresting observation will serve as the basis for unpacking the concepts that follow. Dasein is always already there in the world, a world imbued with meaning. As discussed in the previous video, one mode of relation to this world is attunement, whereby we come into a particular relationship with our thrownness and facticity. Understanding, in contrast, is a mode of relation to the world whereby Dasein becomes aware of the possibilities latent in that facticity. That is, understanding is a mode of being for Dasein in terms of its potentiality of being. Dasein relates to itself not merely in terms of what it already is, but also in terms of what it can be. This understanding does not explain something in terms of efficient causes. Instead, understanding discloses the significance of something, for the sake of which of something. In some ways, it's reminiscent of Aristotle's conception of understanding in the sense of understanding a thing's essence, not in terms of what it is in its actuality, but in terms of its teleology, or the purpose for its being. So one manner of understanding my cat's behavior is in terms of how the hunger centers of the brain signal to other parts of the body to secrete hormones and neurochemicals, thereby initiating certain behaviors that have been conditioned to elicit the necessary response from its owner to feed it. This abstract explanation is not how I usually encounter such a situation. It represents an ontic and not ontological mode of understanding. Instead, I understand my cat is asking for food because of a history of encounters with my cat. I understand that cat's need to eat, which implicitly includes my understanding that living things need to consume food. It is the world of the totality of relevance that makes something significant for me, and not the world of abstract causality and objective presence. At the same time, this understanding discloses to Dasein its mode of existing as a potentiality for being. In understanding the significance of a thing in its totality of relevance, the possibilities of my use of those things is also disclosed. This is what Heidegger means when he says, I know of my possibilities because I have possibilities. My potentiality of being is in being free to discover the significance of things in their potentiality, which in turn brings to light my own potentiality concerning how to use them. Herein we discover how understanding projects the being of Dasein. We should consider this project or projection in relation to thrownness. Dasein is thrown into its facticity, which in turn delivers to Dasein its mode of being as projecting its possibilities. In other words, in my facticity and in my world, I find myself as a being who relates to this world in its possibilities. Projection thus moves us out of the actual and into the unactualized potentiality that essentially belongs to my facticity. It's in this sense, Heidegger writes, that one can truly affirm Nietzsche's proclamation to become what you are. Because what you are is your potentiality and not merely your actuality. We are more than what we factually are, but not more than what we factically are, because our facticity includes the possibilities that are necessarily not facts at all. Thus, understanding in the mode of projection is an understanding through a kind of anticipation, a being ahead or leaping ahead of oneself. In acting affectionately toward me at a particular time of day, my cat's behavior discloses to me my possibility of being the one who can feed her and more generally take care of her. So in understanding that my cat is hungry, not only the possibility of her being fed is disclosed to me, but also my own possibility to be the one who feeds her and more generally to be the one who takes care of her, to become a responsible and loving cat owner. As such, my understanding does not merely address the actual fact that my cat is hungry or that I'm a cat owner, but projects toward a possible future in which I feed her and in which I take care of her as one who is always already in a particular relationship with this animal, a facticity that is imbued with the possibility of caring for my cat. In describing the project character of understanding, Heidegger draws upon the etymological convergences of several terms involving sight. Understanding has been bound with the notion of sight from the very beginnings of philosophy. For Heidegger, the insight gained through understanding is linked to the circumspection of taking care and the considerateness of concern. Heidegger names the particular mode of sight that is oriented toward existence itself as transparency. Transparency entails understanding the full disclosedness of being in the world in its totality. As existing beings, we glimpse ourselves only when we have become transparent to ourselves in terms of our being in the world and being together with others. And as we've seen, the inauthentic mode of being in the world renders us opaque, invisible to ourselves. Heidegger acknowledges this emphasis on sight is not meant to prioritize the physical activities of the eyes, nor is it a kind of non-sensorial perception as one gets when talking about having a vision for certain eidetic truths and or notions of a mind's eye that sees the truth. Heidegger draws on this notion of sight, however, to maintain a connection with a tradition of philosophy that's consistently used sight as a metaphor for understanding, while at the same time questioning how that notion of sight has been previously employed. Two things to mention here. First, the French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty will pick up on this idea and make the phenomenology of perception a central theme in his works. Second, despite not intending to use sight in the literal sense, phenomenologists and other philosophers, including Merleau-Ponty, will to varying degrees depart from this emphasis on sight to consider the role of the body more generally, as well as, in particular, a phenomenology and hermeneutics of touch, something that's been developed more recently by the philosopher Richard Carney. We have so far discussed understanding in terms of projection, whereby possibilities of things are disclosed to Dasein, and through this understanding in turn discloses to Dasein its own potentiality for being. Now we must consider how understanding develops. From understanding emerges interpretation. This distinction might be confusing at first, as understanding and interpretation might be thought of as relatively synonymous. However, for Heidegger, interpretation is the working out of the possibilities projected by understanding. It makes explicit, or as the German word suggests, it lays out what one has understood. As Heidegger states, in interpretation, understanding appropriates what it has understood understandingly. So let's go back to my cat after that quote. I am usually not reflective on why I feed her. I briefly notice that she's calling my attention, and out of habit, reflexively open the can of food and feed her. However, to render explicit my understanding I have of the situation is the act of interpretation. Without taking the analogy too literally, we could say that understanding is like the notion of fast thinking, which was developed by, I believe, Daniel Kahneman, which is based on knowledge that requires minimum conscious intervention. And the interpretation is like slow thinking, an effortful reflection on things that brings them into the light of consciousness. Very easy to fall into a kind of ontic mode of thinking of these matters, whereas what Heidegger is concerned with is the ontological, but hopefully it was more illustrative than misleading. Now, when it comes to interpretation, there are three dimensions to it that Heidegger develops here: the as-structure, the fore-structure, and meaning. The as-structure of interpretation concerns the explicitness of what is understood. It is the making clear of what is already there in the world. So I see my cat as a cat, and I see my cat as hungry, myself as an owner, cat food as cat food, etc. More notable, however, is that in order to engage in this as-structure, it requires already having some preliminary understanding of the thing, what Heidegger calls the fore-structure of interpretation. I'm not Descartes throwing away all my knowledge of the world to arrive at some point of indubitability. Instead, in a sense, I come to my experience preloaded with a specific understanding. More accurately, the world already has a meaning in its totality of relevance within which I'm absorbed prior to explicitly interpreting something. To put this in a manner that the philosopher Gadamer states it, I come to things from within a horizon of understanding, containing its own prejudices. And these prejudices are not something necessarily negative, but in fact are a necessary feature of our ability to understand and interpret our world. Now, contained in this fore-structure is what Heidegger calls forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Each concerns what is made available to me in a manner that is prior to and necessary for making the as-structure explicit. With forehaving, there is pre-understanding concerning the function and purpose of something. Foresight has to do with a particular point of view that directs my attention in a specific manner, guiding later interpretation. Foreconception is the conceptual understanding I have prior to interpretation. Once again, it might be helpful to turn to my example. When I interpret what my cat is doing, I'm not starting from scratch, whereby I forget all I know. My interpretations are, as already stated, preceded by a totality of relevance that surrounds the situation. They're also preceded by the particular perspective I take on the situation. I interpret my cat as hungry rather than merely seeking attention because I implicitly already understand what is entailed in owning a cat. And because I'm oriented toward my cat through a mode of concern and care, I have a vested interest in the happiness and health of my cat. Finally, I have the concept of nourishment and the necessity of food for living beings. And so all of these go into my interpretation of my cat's behavior as being hungry. Yet I could imagine having a different fore-structure in which I come to a different interpretation. If a squirrel approached me in the park and engaged in the same behavior, I might think it has rabies instead of being hungry. Meaning is the becoming aware of the as-structure. When one understands the meaning of something, one understands that thing as that thing. This presentation of meaning differs greatly from the notion of meaning that you get from language analysis, where meaning is about words and propositions. Meaning entails familiarity with the world in the ways I use the things within it. In making explicit the as-structure, meaning emerges out of the fore-structure. Thus, meaning is not some abstract conceptualization of things, but it is a way of existing that expresses the potentiality for being. A final comment concerns this circle of understanding that Heidegger presents us with. The difficulty here is well expressed in Plato's dialogue, the Meno, in which it is asked how you can ask about something if you didn't already know about that thing. Such is the case in which a preliminary and implicit understanding through fore-structure makes possible the explicit interpretations of the meaning of things. Though a circle, Heidegger denies that it's a vicious one, but instead acknowledges that there's no such thing as the view from nowhere. The key, Heidegger states, is not to get out of the circle, which is in fact impossible, but instead to get into the circle in the right way. By which I believe he means to get in the circle in a manner that frees up the possibility for interpretations that further disclose the meaning of being rather than obscure it. To make explicit to myself the meaning of my cat's behavior is not simply to repeat what I already understand, but opens to the possibility of further interpretation. I interpreted my cat's behavior as being hungry and became aware of my possibilities in responding as my cat's owner. In responding to and assuming those possibilities, I decided to leave dry food out for the day, and then came to discover, in actualizing those possibilities, that the meaning of my cat's behavior was not simply to say it's hungry, but that it was hungry specifically for wet food instead. Now there's been a slight shift in meaning, a little bit of a deepening of the meaning of my cat's behavior that I didn't have access to until I began to actualize some of the possibilities embedded in the fore-structure of my understanding. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. You might have noticed that the frequency of these videos coming out has decreased recently, and that is due to just starting up the semester and after a year of online teaching, now actually teaching in person. And it's become a very busy time, which I want to get these videos out more frequently, and but I also want to make sure that I do my best possible job with them. So I'm hoping that I can pick up the pace a little bit more to get out at least a Heidegger video a little bit more than once every 2 weeks. So thank you for your patience during this time. And as always, thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.